Hello, and welcome back to Feeding His Sheep. Thank you for joining us for our study of 2 Kings chapter 7, verses 1 through 20. You know, some people just never learn. If you've read through 2 Kings, back in chapter 5, there was Naaman, the soldier from Syria, who had come down with leprosy. The king of Aram, which is Syria, had sent over $3 million worth of gold, plus silver and clothes, to the king of Israel first, then to Elisha, in an attempt to have Naaman healed. Elisha did so, but he didn't take a dime with him for healing him. But Elisha's servant, Gehazi, he ran after him, and he told a lie so that he could get some silver and clothes. As a result, the leprosy that had been on Naaman ended up on Gehazi and his descendants, according to the last part of chapter 5. So after Naaman was healed, you think everything would be okay between northern Israel and the nation of Aram. But no, the king of Aram kept plotting to kill Israel's king after the prophet from northern Israel had just healed one of his prize soldiers. But Elisha kept warning the king where the ambush was. So in chapter 6, the king of Aram now set his sights on Elisha. He had sent horses and chariots and a great army there, and he surrounds the city that Elisha is staying in. Now Elisha's new servant, who replaced Gehazi, started to panic. But Elisha was calm, and he said that the army of Aram was the one who was outnumbered. Well, there was just two of them in Elisha's house, and this army has them surrounded. But Elisha says that they have them outnumbered. Well, how could this be so? In 2 Kings 6:17, then Elisha prayed and said, O Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Then Elisha prayed for the army to be struck with blindness, and it was so. So here he was, surrounded by enemy soldiers who were just struck blind. Now this old man decides to have a little bit of fun with them. In 2 Kings 6:19, then Elisha said to them, This is not the way, nor is this the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek. And he brought them to Samaria. He took them right to the center of the capital, where the king and the entire military was stationed. And then they were given their sight back to see their predicament. They're right in the middle of enemy territory. You know, the king, he was anxious. He wanted to kill all of them, but Elisha said no. He showed mercy, and Israel fed them and held a great feast and then sent them home. That particular group of marauders never bothered them again. But Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, wasn't having any of this. So he ordered more men to go and lay siege to Samaria, so they did. If you're not familiar with how a siege works, you simply surround the city and cut off all connection with the outside world. Nobody enters the city, nobody leaves the city. Nobody can get out and call for help either. Usually, surrounding farms outside of the city were raided to feed the enemy soldiers and their horses. Water going into the city was often cut off by dams or rerouting rivers. As weeks and months went by with no food or water, people became delirious and desperate. Now imagine other problems arose as well. Garbage piled up within the city as it couldn't be taken to the dumping grounds. Imagine people digging through the garbage for scraps to eat, and there was no sanitation. So the outhouses, or privies as they may have called them, soon overflowed. And people scrounged through that stuff too, looking for something. Now, do you think I'm making this up? Look in 2 Kings 6:25. There was a great famine in Samaria, and behold, they besieged it until a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver, and a fourth of a cab of dove's dung for 5 shekels of silver. And it only got worse from there. I mean, they're eating donkey's head and dove's dung. What can be any worse than that? Well, one day the king's walking about the city wall. He's looking at his predicament. The surrounding army is just as far as the eye can see. And a woman cries out to him with a problem. Apparently, she had struck a deal with another woman of the city, and the other woman didn't hold up her end of the bargain. Well, as a king, even with this big pressing problem and all the city's trouble, he still has to hear their case. 2 Kings 6:28, and the king said to her, What is the matter with you? And she answered, This woman said to me, Give your son that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow. In verse 29, so we boiled my son and ate him, and I said to her on the next day, give me your son that we may eat him, but she has hidden her son. At this the king tore his clothes, and he walked away in disgust and sorrow. But those two emotions combined to form a new emotion, anger. Who is at the root of all of this? After all, it was Elisha who the king of Aram was mad at for always giving away his assassination attempts. If Elisha had just let him kill those soldiers instead of feeding them and sending them away, the king thinks that this wouldn't have happened. So Elijah is sitting at his house, and he has some people with him. And he knows the servant of the king is coming to inform him of his pending royal summons, which means a death sentence. So Elisha tells his servants and his friends to hold the door. From outside, he hears this messenger begin to blame the Lord for his trouble, and he mocks the Lord. Of course, Elijah's about to put God's power on full display. And that brings us to our text in 2 Kings 7. We'll begin with verses 1 and 2. Then Elisha said, listen to the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, tomorrow about this time a measure of fine flour will be sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel in the gate of Samaria. The royal officer on whose hand the king was leaning answered the man of God and said, behold, if the Lord should make windows in heaven, could this thing be? Then he said, behold, you will see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat of it. Elisha tells this messenger that all of this mess is about to be over, while the messenger is spouting a lack of faith in God, period. Now we're going to see him doubt that God can do any of the things that Elisha is prophesying. Elisha begins by talking about a drastic cut in the sky-high food prices that they've been having. Sounds nice, doesn't it? If God is the answer to Israel and Samaria's inflation and food shortage problem, no doubt He's the answer to ours too. But remember what the people were eating and what they were paying for it. At that time, silver was about $5.42 in American money per troy ounce. 1 shekel was around a half an ounce, so a shekel is $2.71 in United States currency. If a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels, that's $216. It's not a very appetizing thing to eat, and that was almost all they could find with the city being under siege. If that's too gross, that cup of dove's dung was bringing 5 shekels, or $13.55. I know that makes you want to gag, but remember, people in our country actually eat artichokes and kelp, and to me, that's just as bad. So when Elisha states that the next day prices will drop on flour and barley, this means it's going to be available again. That means that food's going to have to come into the city if it's going to be for sale, and that means that the siege is going to be over. But the messenger outside the door didn't catch that in his mind. To him, it's a done deal. It's going to last forever. This siege is just the part of life. And he says the only way that this could happen is if the Lord opened windows from heaven and dropped food down from the sky, like He did with the manna during the Exodus in Egypt. Apparently, he doesn't believe that God is capable of ending this siege or giving them victory, much less making food plentiful and affordable. But Elisha says, not only will their flour and barley be available, 6 quarts of flour is going to cost $2.70. 12 quarts of barley is going to cost $2.70. You know, commentaries state that this price was still inflated for that time period, but it's radically cheaper than the days that they have gone under siege for the last few months. You know, I'm not the grocery shopper of my family, but I'll take that over donkey heads and dove poop any day. Now notice what Elisha told the messenger there at the end. The price drop and the sudden availability of goods will happen within 24 hours, and that messenger will see it, but he won't live to eat any of it. Remember that, because this is a prophecy that will be fulfilled. Let's move on in our text in 2 Kings 7, and we'll cover verses 3 through 8. Now there were 4 leprous men at the entrance of the gate, and they said to one another, why do we sit here until we die? If we say we will enter into the city, then the famine is in the city, and we will die there. And if we sit here, we die also. Now therefore come, and let us go over to the camp of the Arameans. If they spare us, we will live. If they kill us, we will but die. They arose at twilight to go to the camp of the Arameans, and when they came to the outskirts of the camp of the Arameans, behold, there was no one there. For the Lord had caused the army of the Arameans to hear the sounds of chariots and the sound of horses, even the sound of a great army, so that they said to one another, Behold, the king of Israel is hired against us, the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians, to come upon us. Therefore they arose and fled in the twilight, and left their tents and their horses and their donkeys, even the camp just as it was, and fled for their life. When these lepers came to the outskirts of the camp, they entered one tent and ate and drank, and carried from there silver and gold and clothes, and went and hid them. And they returned and entered another tent, and carried from there also, and went and hid them. Here we have 4 men with leprosy. They're sitting outside the gate discussing their predicament. They're not welcome within the city. Leprosy had made them outcasts. They're untouchables. But have you ever noticed how much God specializes in using people just like that to do great things? He uses the most unlikely of people to accomplish His will. Charles Spurgeon once said, if you were to take out of Scriptures all of the stories that have anything to do with the poor, the afflicted, if you took out the Psalms of the sorrowful, the promises of the distressed, and all the passages belonging to the children of grief, the Bible would be a very small book. So, back to these 4 lepers we find here in their predicament. An interesting thing to ponder, some Jewish traditions say that these 4 were actually Gehazi and his 3 sons. Remember, he received the leprosy that Naaman had, and according to chapter 5, he received it and also all of his descendants. So there they were, sitting outside, just as hungry as those that's inside the city. They're not allowed to go inside, but there's nothing to eat in there anyway. And even if there was any food, they would be the last people to receive any. They couldn't roam very far either, because the Aramean armies were camped all around them, just out of bowshot range. So they decided they may as well surrender to the enemy. I mean, it makes sense. If they stay where they are, they're going to starve and die. If they go into the city, they're going to starve and die. But if they go to the enemy, it's a 50-50 chance. They will either be accepted or they'll be killed. And that death is going to be much more humane than starvation would be, sitting outside the city, feeling sorry for yourself while suffering from leprosy on top of that. So when they go to the enemy and they reach the camp, it's empty. The enemy had been there for months, and now there's no one left in sight. But all of their food, their supplies, their clothes, their money, their silver, everything was still there. If it were not for verses 6 and 7, we would not have known the miracle that God did to deliver Samaria from the enemy. It said that He caused them to hear what sounded like the noise of a great army. I mean, bigger than just the Israeli army, possibly the Hittites and all of the Egyptians, everybody combined. That's what the people heard. So these soldiers abandoned their post. They fled for their lives, and they barely took anything with them. We're going to see in a few verses that those who did try to carry stuff with them when they ran dropped what they're carrying in the road so they can run even faster. I wonder if God actually made this noise come out of the air, or if He just simply put the perception of noise in the minds of these soldiers. Either way, He did it, as only God is capable of doing. So verse 8 mentions that they came to the edge of the camp. They had already reached the first edge and discovered the place was empty. I'd read a commentary that claimed that this verse was talking about the other edge, away from the city. They had journeyed through the entire fortified camp, just taking inventory of everything that's left, making a note of everything that there was. Once they searched to the far end of the camp and still didn't see anybody, they knew that it was safe. So they dug in and tore into a meal as soon as possible. And you can't really blame these guys. I mean, there's no telling how long it's been since they had a meal. This was an answer to every hope and prayer that these lepers ever had. But then human nature kicked in. They knew that this discovery wouldn't be a secret forever. So they took some of the treasures, they left the city and they hid them. Then they came back for a second load and they took some more out and hid that. This is why I actually believe the Jewish tradition that said that these lepers were Gehazi and his 3 sons. I mean, we saw in the past how greed overtook him when Naaman offered Elisha a great reward, and he lied and deceived just so he can get a change of clothes and some silver. But these people were not rebuked for it yet. Maybe they were justifying this in their mind. They're thinking, we would be banned from this camp if we were in the city because of our leprosy. They wouldn't be allowed inside this city either. And when people come in and started to eat everything, they would be the last people to get anything, even though they were the four that discovered it. So this does sound like something that can happen, and they were right to enjoy their part in the miracle that God provided. But there was no need to keep being greedy. Even though they were cast out by those that's in the city, those people needed help. Those people needed hope. Everybody in that city still believed that they were under siege. They had consumed their animals. They had resorted to cannibalism. They're eating their children, of all things. Some people went to bed that night not expecting to wake up. They likely even hoped that they would die of starvation that would take them in their sleep and end their suffering. And here these guys were. New clothes, new shoes, full bellies, a lot of neat treasures hidden in a safe place. They're surrounded by more food and supplies than 4 people could ever need. Now let's look at verses 9 through 11. Then they went and said to one another, "We are not doing right. This day is a day of good news, but we are keeping silent. If we wait until morning light, punishment will overtake us. Now therefore come, let us go and tell the king's household." So they came and called to the gatekeepers of the city, and they told them, saying, "We came to the camp of the Arameans, and behold, there was no one there, nor the voice of man, only the horses tied and the donkeys tied, and the tents just as they were." The gatekeepers called and told it within the king's household. Once they got their bellies full and they couldn't think of anything else that they could possibly need, they began to realize they had a responsibility. They'd enjoyed this miracle that God had provided long enough. It's time to share this with all of the starving people back into the city and give them the great news that, hey, this siege is over. The enemy is gone. They seemed to understand that remaining there and keeping the good news to themselves for very much longer would become sinful. So they realized that they must go and share this good news. Now, they couldn't just go into the city, much less to the king, because they're lepers. So they called out to the gatekeepers to tell them the news. Now, being lepers, they had to maintain social distancing, which means they had to shout the good news to the keepers. They had to yell it. Well, they had no walkie-talkies back then. These guards didn't, to get the news to the king. By the way, who is responsible for naming that invention anyway? Sir, we just invented this wireless communications device. It doesn't require telephone lines or towers. It works in the middle of nowhere. And for power usage, it only requires a tiny battery. What shall we name this breakthrough discovery? Walkie-talkie. Who named that? But these guards didn't have these things, so they had to shout the report to other guards so they wouldn't leave their post. One guard would shout it across to another guard, that guard would shout it to another, and the word would eventually get to the king. But all of this shouting was heard by the people in the city, and it woke them up. They perked up at the sound of these voices that carried good news. Could this really be true? Is the enemy really gone? Is there food just laying around all over the place? If they were excited about food laying around all over and clothes being scattered everywhere, forget the enemy camp. They can just come raid my children's bedroom. There's old food and clothes scattered everywhere in those places. Now let's look at verses 12 through 15. Then the king arose in the night and said to his servants, "I will now tell you what the Arameans have done to us. They know that we're hungry. Therefore they have gone out from the camp to hide themselves in the field, saying, when they come out of the city, we will capture them alive and get into the city." One of his servants said, "Please, let some men take 5 of the horses which remain, which are left in the city. Behold, they will be in any case like all the multitude of Israel who are left in it. Behold, if they will see in any case like all the multitude of Israel who have already perished, so let us send and see." So they took therefore 2 chariots with horses, and the king sent after the army the Arameans, saying, "Go and see." They went after them to the Jordan, and behold, all the way was full of clothes and equipment which the Arameans had thrown away in their haste. Then the messengers returned and told the king. This poor old king thinks everything is a trap. When the king of Syria sent Naaman there with all of this gold looking for a cure, the king thought it was a trap. Now he thinks that they're just hiding in the bushes, waiting to ambush them. Well, if that was the case, wouldn't the enemy have ambushed these 4 lepers? I have to say, at least the king was being sensible about this. He's wise enough to think that if something is too good to be true, it probably is. But in this case, it was the hand of God that delivered them. It made sense to the king, though, to test things out before going in. Or maybe it only made sense after one of his servants put that idea in his head to test this good news. How tragic would it have been if they continued to sit there, cooped up and starving when there's no longer a threat? So they sent 2 chariots and 5 horses. You notice it said 5 of the horses that are left. That tells me that the king and his people have been munching on Mr. Ed for a while to stay alive this whole time. So the messengers go out and they come back confirming that this good news that the siege is over and that even the roads are covered in things for the taking. I do have to point out that when God says something is going to happen, it will definitely happen. Elisha told them the day before that by the next day the price of flour and barley will be lower and they will be available. And he told the guard that was sent as a messenger that he wouldn't get to eat any of it. So let us look at the verses immediately following these to get the full story. You know, the king couldn't just let people go out without having it done in an orderly manner. It's like releasing children from school. You tell them to form an orderly line, go out the door in a single file. Otherwise they would just trample each other in the doorway. So he ordered that same guard to be in charge of the gate. You can see where this is going, can't you? These people are starving. They're half crazy. They've been cooped up for months. They're not going to form a single file line and patiently wait their turn, especially since they've been watching other people eat their own children. They're in panic mode. They're in survival mode. And in their eyes, they think the king wants to get there first, so the king will own all of this food. And then he can take whatever he wants as a payment for the food, as if they had anything left to spend, and that simply will not do in their eyes. Verse 17 says, "Now the king appointed the royal officer on whose hand he leaned to have charge of the gate. But the people trampled on him at the gate, and he died, just as the man of God said, who spoke when the king came down to him." Verse 18 says, "It happened just as the man of God had spoken to the king, saying, 2 measures of barley for a shekel and a measure of fine flour for a shekel will be sold tomorrow at this time at the gate of Samaria." Verses 19 and 20, "Then the royal officer answered the man of God and said, 'Now behold, that the Lord should make windows in heaven. Could such a thing be?' And he said, 'Behold, you will see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat of it.' And so it happened to him, for the people trampled on him at the gate, and he died." All because of his unbelief. He only saw a glimpse of others getting to enjoy God's blessings and God's provision, but he didn't get to partake in any of it. Now, although he didn't believe and although he didn't get to enjoy God's deliverance, at least he got to be a stepping stone on people's path to freedom, right? Sorry, I had to. Thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe and come back for more study material. Until next time, may God richly bless you as you walk with Him.